again. Fab. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you in particular to our two panelists. If you could, we've got Johnny in the background kind of helping me make sure I answer Q&A and things like that. So if you could put yourself on speaker view, and that means that Johnny's blank screen won't just be there the whole time. And that's in the top right hand corner of your Zoom. I won't go too much into introducing our speakers because I think they will probably do a better job of doing that themselves. But just to say, you know, just to reiterate, we're here talking about and remembering Maureen Colquhoun, who was the UK's first out lesbian MP and sadly passed away a couple of weeks ago. She represented Northampton North for a relatively short time for reasons that we'll come on to in the 1970s. I think there's a belief sometimes that Chris Smith was the first out gay MP, but he was actually almost 10 years later, and as we'll come on to, came out himself voluntarily in comparison to Maureen. But I'm, you know, as I say, I'm not going to go too much into the history because we've got two people who are really, really qualified to do that themselves. So first of all, we've got Sammy Sturgess, who's a historian from the History of Parliament project and also a graduate of the Queer History Centre at Goldsmith College in London. And then we've also got Carla, who's our fab women's officer in the LGBTQIA+ network and a Labour activist up north, and just in general a fab campaigner for queer women in public and in politics and in all sorts of spaces. So I think I'm going to come to Sammy first. If you could just give us kind of a general intro to the History of Parliament project and then an overview of Maureen's career and why it's so important that we talk about and remember her. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, thanks, Holly. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so the History of Parliament project, actually, we're having our 70th birthday this year for sort of it's complicated, but the restarting of the project after the war, because we originally founded in 1936, but then yeah, the Second World War kind of scuppered work. So we've been going for 70 years now in our current format, and the History of Parliament project is creating a comprehensive history of Parliament through biographies and writing articles about constituency politics. So we produce these really huge tomes of sort of A to Z, like dictionaries of MPs and now peers. We currently hold volumes from like the 14th century to the 19th century. So we're still like filling in some of the gaps there. And we also have an oral history project which deals with so the later 20th century. Unfortunately, we were unable to get Maureen before she passed away. Oftentimes we do interview quite elderly former MPs, but obviously they have to want to do it. And I don't think, as we were just saying beforehand, Maureen was really that enamoured with being involved in a parliamentary project. Yeah, so that's basically what the History of Parliament is. I am the public engagement manager there, so I do lots of different outreach work. And as Holly said, yeah, I just graduated from Goldsmiths, where I was researching lesbian sadomasochism and its culture in London in the late 70s to the mid 90s. So this is my period. And yeah, so I did a bit of research on Maureen Colquhoun last year for LGBT History Month, and I wrote a blog about her career. So yeah, so as Holly also said, Maureen Colquhoun was MP for Northampton North between 1974 and 1979. She, before that, had been involved in local politics, mainly in Sussex, which is where she lived with her then husband, Keith Colquhoun, and their children. And she'd been a councillor for, I'm getting this confused. Sorry, she stood as a parliamentary candidate in Tonbridge in Kent, but was unsuccessful before she was elected for Northampton North. But she was also a local councillor in Sussex. I think Shoreham-on-Sea, is the district. Yeah, so she'd been a member of the Labour Party since she was 18, and she'd studied economics at the LSE, which is obviously a school that is well known for its political activism on the left. The Gay Liberation Front was formed there in 1970, you know, so I think she was in and around all those kind of left activist circles and political movements from an early age, and that she was known for being very outspoken even in her days before Parliament. I think there was a case where they tried to chuck her out of various parts of the council to silence her, basically, because she wouldn't like shut up about the issues she cared about, and the men that she worked with didn't like it, and all the people that voted for her to be removed from these groups were men. But fortunately, she had a colleague who was a female who said, you can't do that, actually, and allowed, you know, Maureen to speak, rightfully so, because she was, yeah, you know, not treated fairly in politics from the very beginning, really. I don't know, Holly, how much do you want me to talk about her career and sort of later parts now, or are you going to come onto that later?
I think that's probably a really great intro. So yeah, I think we'll come on to that later. Great timing, thank you. Just to come on to Carla. So as I said, Carla is the LGBTQIA+ Advocacy Group's Women's Officer. And when, you know, we sort of discussed putting this event on, was really, really passionate about getting involved. So Carla, if I could just come to you and ask a bit about what, as a, you know, as a queer woman nowadays, does Maureen mean to you? And hearing some of what Sammy's just said, what's your kind of reflections on that?
I think the doesn't shut up thing at a council meeting, where she wasn't even supported by her colleagues in the Labour Party. It was somebody from across, it was a fellow woman from across the aisle, I think in the Liberal Democrats. I can't, her name slips my mind, but even her own colleagues wouldn't help her. And I just find that incredible. Yet, despite that, she then still went on to stand and she put herself forward, like Sammy said, in these seats in the South where, you know, she had no chance of winning, but she still put herself out there and was a furious campaigner and did it. And she got the Northampton North seat because it was a relatively new seat and they weren't expected to win it. And at that time, the Labour Party had kind of a policy for putting women in unwinnable seats. So at least there were candidates, but they didn't have much of a chance of getting in. So it didn't really matter because if they got in anyway, they weren't expecting to get in. So she put herself forward in this area. And I think that tenacity is just something that really still speaks true to this day, in both politics and in the private spheres. And I think the issues that she fought about within Parliament, she was so ahead of her time. And she was really, you know, that this feeling of not wanting to shut up, she never did. She spoke on, you know, advocated for abortion rights and women's rights to choose, the decriminalisation of sex workers. This woman was like a powerhouse. She brought 40 sex workers in to the private room in Parliament when the decriminalisation bill was being read. You know, she just was a really forward thinker to the point where the private members bill that she put forward, which was called the Balance of the Sexes, and when she put that forward in Parliament, it didn't go through like many private members bills, and there was some controversy around what happened in the House when it was being spoken about. However, that's still so the private members bill about balance of the sexes advocated that if public money was being spent on a board, so let's say that the Board of Sugar, I think, was one of them, where public money was being spent, or the Board of Railways, it should represent the public. So it should be a 50-50 split between men and women. And this was so radical at the time. This bill only got accepted by Scotland in 2018, and there's still no equivalent bills within England or Wales. And it just kind of shows that the ideas that she had and spoke about in Parliament were relevant then, just as they are now. And unfortunately, a lot of the things that she pushed in Parliament, we still haven't got there in terms of equality. So she's just an amazing woman, really, that I think we should all really take stock from. She was, I think, globally, she was the second out member of a parliament, shortly after a lady in New Zealand whose name slips my mind. But yeah, so she's just a trailblazer, really.
Yeah, I think you're right. That was one of the things that really struck me when I was doing my research for this event, is that a lot of the things that she campaigned on, you mentioned decrim of sex work, you know, balance on boards, are things that would still be considered quite radical today.
Yeah.
And the amount of backlash that she faced, not just as a woman, not just as a queer woman, but also as a queer woman, quote unquote, daring to come forward and speak up about these things, was immense, which is now something I want to come on to. Carla, we've spoken a lot, you and I, about the role of the press in this. Can you take us through what happened? And I also, when you were speaking, both of you, I was reflecting on, you know, we have a tendency to go, oh my God, she's so cool, yes. But like, what's the sort of mental and personal toll of her putting herself out there like that? If you know what I mean.
I think Sammy can speak to that side of things a little bit when in kind of reflecting in the kind of the hurt that she took from Parliament. But if I can just kind of outline her outing, which was when she was working on her private members bill, the balance of the sexes, she met somebody called Babs Todd, who was the editor of Sappho, which was a lesbian magazine at the time. And they fell in love. They didn't mean to, but they fell in love, and she left her husband and moved in with Babs. And her husband was actually quite supportive of this. She didn't have any kind of ill feeling there. And they were holding a housewarming party, and they'd sent out these invitations where two women were embracing. And one of the friends who attended the housewarming party had been blackmailed by a Daily Mail reporter and had been threatened that if she didn't come forward with some type of information, then he would go to the American embassy and tell them that she was lesbian because she was a teacher applying for a visa. And at the time, she would have been denied a visa because of reasons of deviancy, because she was a lesbian. And so she was blackmailed. This didn't come out for 3 years. So if you can imagine, you've got, you're not, she never, her and Babs never lied about the relationship, but somehow this explosion of your personal life has happened in the press, and you don't know where it's come from. So you don't know who's spoken, who you can trust, and who is safe. And her family were hounded by the press. Think like reporters hiding in the bushes outside of her house. Think the phone ringing off the hook with people trying to get any tidbits of information. Think about your mum's house. Her mum's house was staked out during kind of all this press frenzy. And then to kind of top it off, all of this was happening, which is really horrible, and you don't know where this has come from. And her colleagues didn't come out and support her. She didn't receive any support from her colleagues, and yet she still kept her head above water. She never denied her sexuality, and even had the audacity to challenge people when they wanted her to talk about her sexuality. And she said, hey, my sexuality has got nothing to do with how well I can do my job, just in the same way that my heterosexual peers, their sexuality hasn't got anything to do with the way that they do their jobs. And by the way, you're not going out there asking them all of these questions when you're asking me. And as a result of this, she complained to the press council, and they said that she wasn't entitled to her freedom because basically she'd already put herself out there with her public views on feminism. And she was basically asking for it. The Spectator at the time said that, hey, you may want to inquire about and be curious about MPs' private lives. It doesn't mean you need to have that curiosity satisfied. Oh, but in the case of Maureen Colquhoun, because she's a lesbian, she speaks on feminism issues, you should probably know that because it puts it in some kind of grimy, dirty context. I mean, that bit wasn't written, but that's definitely the undertones. And I think so you can kind of get a feeling as to how horrendous the press coverage was at this time, and how the lack of support from your colleagues could put you in a really difficult position. And the subsequent knock-on effects of this in terms of her attempted deselections really, I think, took a toll on her, because when I don't know if I should go into much more detail now, because I think maybe Sammy can speak to this, which is, although she did fight deselection, and it went up to the NEC, and the NEC repealed it because a campaign group formed around her, and she was even supported by like the National Railwaymen Union, I think, who said that she was actually being deselected not for the reasons that they stated, but because of her private life, and she was entitled to that. And so it got repealed at NEC. However, then her local Labour Party again tried to deselect her, and she fought this again. And I think that that's just incredible. And when it came to I think it was the 79 elections, she actually got selected by the grassroots. There was a kind of local grassroots campaign who said, actually, she's been a good MP, we want to put her forward again. But that was the year that Thatcher got in, and she unfortunately lost her seat. And then she didn't really go back into Parliament, but did kind of still was heavily involved within public life. But I think within the context of what happened when she was there and the lack of support that she received, you can kind of understand why you wouldn't want to, if that had happened in a workplace that wasn't Parliament, you probably wouldn't want to go and work back there, despite the fact that she never stopped fighting for people's rights ever, really. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good time to come back to Sammy and sort of talk about the role of the local party in this, and the party leadership, and that lack of support, and what happened around the deselection. Yeah, if you could just talk a little bit more about that, as Carla says, and perhaps going on to you spoke about she wasn't keen to necessarily engage in Parliament, the sort of mental and emotional toll that all of this took on her in her life.
Yeah, sure. I think also it's important to kind of say here as well, thinking, I mean, a lot of my research has been on sort of more grassroots activism, but not necessarily in kind of like that arranged activism from like a political party standpoint, just sort of like general queer activism and outrage at the way that queer people are being treated in, the late 70s and into the 80s, and still today in some and many aspects of life. But I think it's really important to sort of point out that what Maureen Colquhoun represented, or still represents, is the way that feminism had different sections. It was like, we can't consider feminism as like a one monolithic thing. She campaigned heavily in Parliament, and also, she was outspoken outside of Parliament, but feminism and the feminist movement and the women's liberation movement relied really heavily on grassroots activism. And what she represents is how parliamentary activism and grassroots activism actually collided in her, and the issues that she came up against. But also she represents the fact that what women, and particularly queer women, had to put up with in order to make themselves heard. In the same way, if you look at later sort of press campaigns that were involving women in politics, the Blair's Babes in '97, and the way that women are portrayed in the media compared to the way that male politicians are compared in the media. And I think she is a shining example of how those two worlds collide, and also the crap that women, and particularly queer women, have to put up still today in a lot of respects, have to put up with just because of their gender and sexuality. But yeah, then thinking about the deselection, as Carla's pointed out, there were so many reasons that were given that weren't her sexuality as to why she was being deselected. The main reason, the most famous one, is the fact that she made some comments to a journalist who was interviewing her about a speech that Enoch Powell had made, that sort of aligned, she calls it being willfully misunderstood, that the journalist willfully misunderstood what she said, and she said she was airing some grievances about the way the Labour Party were not dealing with racism, basically. and the journalist twisted that to say that she agreed with what Powell had said, but what she was actually doing was saying, I think racism is terrible and the Labour Party are failing in the way that they're handling racism. And so then it became this whole, again, press thing where she was like, you know, demonized because, you know, that's what they wanted to do to her, you know. In this, it happens time and time again, you know, the press decided they wanted to portray her in a particular way, and that's what they were going to do. And I think that then, you know, created many problems for her. And as Carla's also said, she didn't have any support from her local party in this. And there are a few examples of letters that she was sent by parliamentary colleagues like Jeremy Thorpe, for example, who quietly stated their support for her with regards to her outing and also deselection, but there was no outward, like, this is outrageous from anyone in the political sphere. The only place that she sort of found support was the women's movement, was through feminism. And as Carla pointed out, you know, I think it was called the Maureen Colquhoun Action Group. I've written that down somewhere in my terrible notes. But
yeah, Action Group, I think it was. Yeah, really,
yeah,
really spiffingly titled.
Yeah, and they, you know, they were advertised in Spare Rib, a feminist magazine at the time, to sort of like gain support. But yeah, she really suffered, and I think that did have a lasting effect. And actually, I did an event last night where I was speaking with Baroness Barker, Liz Barker, who's the LGBT representative in the House of Lords at the moment. And, you know, she, I think, has sort of better firsthand experience. And, you know, she lived through that time. And, you know, she was saying that Maureen Colquhoun was just completely like wounded by the whole experience, because I mean, it must have been absolutely horrible. And like you said, Carla, what's amazing about her is that she didn't give up, and she would, you know, you would see her all over the place, like wearing her necklace with the women's symbol on it, you know, wherever she was. And I think it is a real shame that no one really knows about her and knows about her story. So I think, yeah, it's really great that we're getting to speak about her tonight. But yeah, I think to be honest, you know, Carla covered a lot of what I would have said about the deselection process. It was just like a slog, is like the impression you get, a real slog for her. But she didn't quit, and she got to stand in the election, you know. And yes, she was defeated by the Conservative candidate because it was 1979. But yeah, I think if I was her, I would just be exhausted by that point and be quite happy to retire off up to the Lake District, where I think she was still involved in local politics.
Parish council and things like that.
Yeah. But I mean, fair play to not want to get back involved in Parliament after all that.
I think.
Yeah, definitely. Completely. Oh, sorry, carry on.
Sorry, the overwhelming thing for me that sums that up is something that she said, which was when she was fighting her second deselection. So she'd taken, the first had gone all the way up, and then when she was fighting her second deselection, she said, even if I get deselected, I shall stand alone representing human rights. And just to have, like, you know, to still have that outward, I'm still going to do it, and I'm here, and I'm not going away, and these rights need fighting for, and I'm going to do them, is yeah, I'm just enamored by that, really.
Yeah, completely. I want to come on to a question that I received in advance from the network's new secretary, Ellie. Ellie's doing a project on Maureen at the moment at uni, so shout out to Ellie. And I think it's a good time, you know, given all this outcry and everything, why, in both of your opinions, has Maureen been so widely forgotten by history? Why do so many of us, including those of us like myself who count ourselves as being, you know, pretty involved, not know so much about her? Whoever wants to jump in first.
I can go first. I think lesbian history is just been eradicated really, and I think maybe Sammy can speak to this in a better capacity than I can, but I think women who, you know, just to put this into context of why I think she's forgotten, she asked the Speaker of the House if she could be referred to as Miss, because it's Ms, sorry, because it's not Miss yet to be married or Mrs married to a man, but Miss. And I think the newspaper headline the next day was something along the lines of, Miss is now equal to male, or it was something around that, which was like, how dare this woman? This is like 1970, must have been about in and around that time, not that long ago. That was the attitude, which was, how dare this woman try and equate a title to be equal to a man? And I think when you put it in that context, that starts to unravel why women who refused to not be who they were, to not be the stereotype that society wanted them to be, to shout out for their rights, to say, I want access to healthcare, to say I want to be a doctor. Those women, if they didn't fit in a box, and if in some ways they weren't successful, it's just like, we'll not remember those because they're on the untidy bits of history. And I think especially with Maureen, because if you let the party decades later kind of issued an apology, her local constituency. And I think when you're at the point of admitting an apology, it's easier to let things fade away when they're uncomfortable in your past. And let's not forget that some of the people that she was in Parliament with are not that old, and some of them are still alive. I'm not sure if some of them are still sitting, but that's quite uncomfortable, because how she was treated and how that kind of looks in the context of today is a very deeply uncomfortable place to be. And so no wonder people don't want to talk about it and don't want to actively remember her.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And it's, you know, it is absolutely right, because there are instances I can think of where, you know, just sort of like for an analogy, you know, we've tweeted about things like Section 28 and protests about various things that I don't remember specifics of right now in our History of Parliament capacity. And then we have got sort of a backlash of MPs who were in the chamber when a certain thing, you know, happened, or when the riots about Section 28 happened, and was kind of like disgusted that we'd portrayed like Parliament in that negative light, even though it was like, this is just the facts, these things happened, and we're not, you know. So I think you're absolutely right that it's easier for people just to ignore it. And I think as well, in a world where if we pay attention to figures like Maureen Colquhoun and others who have been treated horribly, it not only makes us question our behavior then, it makes us question our behavior now. And, you know, thinking about the question of trans representation, you know, there's no trans representation. And by looking at our behavior, or Parliament looking at its behavior with Maureen and others, it has to then think, well, we're still failing now. So, and people don't, you know, it's unpleasant and it's icky, and people don't want to face it, I think is the long and short of it. But it's so important, you know, for, you know, groups like yours to exist, and for us to be talking about these issues, because hopefully, you know, by us doing this, we're honoring her legacy and hoping, you know, to keep driving that change. Because, you know, I read in Sarah Crook has written an article about Maureen Colquhoun and feminism in the 1970s, which is very good. And you know, she talks about things being seeded by Maureen, like issues being seeded. And I think that it always happens like this in politics, doesn't it? You know, you have to have the trailblazer, the person who sticks their neck out on the line, talks about things, gets their bills rejected, so that then decades later the seeds, you know, can grow and become trees. Because I think it does take time, and it's amazing that there are people like Maureen that have existed and exist now that are brave enough to stick their neck out to be that person, because without them, then, you know, the progress wouldn't happen.
Yeah, I completely agree. I want to come on, I think you've made a really good point there about trans representation, and I want to come to two questions which kind of ask two sides of the same coin. So one from Ellie, which I received in advance, which is about if Maureen had entered politics today, how different would her experience have been? And then I think the other side of that coin is Show's question, which we've received in the chat. And remember, everybody, do post your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll come to them, you know, during the conversation. And Show said the way that Maureen was treated by the press seems to be repeating itself with other marginalised groups. For instance, Monroe Bergdorf deleting her Twitter account due to the barrage of abuse she received. So anyone who doesn't know Monroe, she's an amazing black trans woman model who was appointed for a while in the Equalities Office of Labour and received a huge amount of backlash and eventually stood down from that position. And Show says, what can we learn from Maureen to help trans figureheads now? And I think that's kind of, you know, that in some ways is pointing out how far hopefully we have come, but also how far we still have to go. So I think I'll come to Carla first on that.
Wow, that's a lot of
it's a big question, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, two questions at the same time. So I think support. So if you look at what was lacking primarily was public support of colleagues, and I think it's when those around you who speak and speak to your truth and kind of testify around you and say, no, I'm willing. You know, the reason that we uncomfortably forget Maureen and are thankful for her is because, like Sammy said, she sticks her neck out. There's nothing so lonely as sticking your neck out by yourself. And so what we can learn is let's stick our necks out together, because I think if you can present, you know, it's about presenting a united front. And if you've not just got your the activists who are always going to be kind of fighting your corner, they're the people that, you know, that you can rely on and prop you up. It's when you're accepted by people that are without kind of outside of that sphere that come in and say, hey, I'm not standing for that. No, that's which is the point. You've got to think about the press are there to make money. And if you're speaking to the wrong side of the public because the public's being so supportive, then you're going to be changing your story. Otherwise, people are going to be less and less interested in reading it. And I know we've got this press environment that thrives off division, and actually I think that's where the solution lies, is coming forward with support and saying, I support you, I don't stand for this, and I think that's where we can really learn the difference in kind of Maureen's time and now. And I think the other question was, what would Maureen have been like if she was still in Parliament, or she came to Parliament now? I think she would be right behind the most pressing issues of the day, and really fighting for the radical issues that we see now, one of which is still gender equality on public boards, by the way. So what she was fighting for in the 1970s would still need fighting now. The decriminalisation of sex work still needs fighting for now. She was a big proponent of teaching about homosexuality in schools and having a massive campaign. Oh, is that around? Well, no, not really. Do schools who stick their neck out and try and teach about little kids about relationships and how it's okay to have ones between the same sex? Do they get doorstopped by parents? Oh, let me think. Yes, they do. So I think she would be just as relevant now, but maybe perhaps significantly more successful within her career. And whereas before she was vilified, I think she would kind of be put very much on a pedestal now. So those are my kind of answers. I think she would still be an absolute powerhouse, fighting for kind of the most marginalized really.
Yeah, I agree, because it's like, yeah, it's important to remember all of the work that she did, the things that you've mentioned there, but she was a huge advocate for human rights as well, as you've mentioned, and she campaigned on various issues, yeah, sort of outside like classic women's issues that would have been, you know, that women who entered Parliament at that time were expected to just sort of like, well, you know, you deal with like the women's and children's issues in education, and sort of be pigeonholed into that. And I think as well, that's another reason why Maureen, you know, was sort of like pinpointed, because she didn't just slot herself into those classical women's issues. And I'm not saying that all female MPs at that time did, but she seemed incredibly frustrated by the lack of feminist integrity that some of her parliamentary colleagues had at that time. And I think, as you said, now, you know, Parliament is a different place now. And I think, you know, right down to the way that the staff, like, you know, LGBT plus staff are treated, that, you know, there are networks within Parliament that I don't actually, we aren't a parliamentary department, but we have access to all those services on the parliamentary estate. So, you know, there's this organization called Parley Out. So any staff member, any member of Parliament, any peer can join the Parley Out group, and, you know, you can go to events and there's talks and, you know, meetups. Well, usually there's meetups, you know, and it's great. And there is that sort of like Parliament-wide like camaraderie and support that there absolutely was not, you know. And you've got to think Maureen was doubly fighting it, because she was fighting against the fact that she was a woman and the fact that she was a lesbian. You know, it was, if she'd have been in Parliament now, it would have been a completely different kettle of fish. And I agree with you that her career would have taken a very different route. And I think she, you know, could have done amazing things if she'd have been in Parliament now. And what was the other question again?
It was about learnings for trans people and their position in politics. And when you were talking about the position of LGBT staffers, it just made me think of a certain Labour MP who bullied trans people so much on Twitter that their only LGBT staffer quit, which was only last year. So it does kind of bring into the fore that we have a long way to go. So yeah, what's your reflection on that question in terms of learnings for I suppose allies of trans people?
Yeah, I mean, it's still such a terrible, you know, it's terrible that we're still having to have these conversations, isn't it? Because, you know, as we all know, it's often the case that, you know, the LGBT plus acronym gets thrown around, but that it's not really equal. The rights for the people within those groups are not equal. And I think there's so much more to do. And I know, with specific reference to the Parley Out group, for example, that is something that they are trying really hard to, you know, to combat. And they have loads of great events that incorporate trans experience. And I know that there are trans members of the group. And so that's heartening. But it just seems to not be feeding up. And I think because there's, you know, there's just so much transphobia, and there's so much, like, I don't know what it is, but I think it seems to be that we're just so far behind in that area in the political system, you know, at sort of like member level. I don't know what the answer is. But what I do know is that, so we do a lot of work with other heritage organisations within Parliament, so like the Parliamentary Archives, the Education Team, the Works of Art people, and we're hopefully going to be putting on a workshop at some point later in the year, which is specifically addressing this issue of, like, we feel like we want to represent trans experience and trans lives and legislation to do with trans experience in our work, but we don't have any trans representation in, you know, in my organisation, in the Parliamentary Archives, etc. So hopefully, what I hope that we're going to do, and what we're trying to do, is to recruit some trans people that, you know, are activists and that, or are not activists and just are interested in legislation, sort of through our history networks, that can help us, because we don't want to do it the issues and injustice. We don't want to do the wrong thing. We don't want to be patronizing. We want to do something meaningful that will help to educate ourselves and also educate other people. So I think there are conversations that are happening in, you know, sort of, yeah, the heritage and education elements of Parliament, which is fantastic, but I don't know what the answer is in terms of feeding it further up. And yeah.
Neither. It's such a difficult issue, and I hope, you know, our group, the advocacy group and the Young Fabians, can play some role in, you know, in helping to create a safe space for trans people in Labour, because it can be a really horrible place at times. I, you know, completely understand and admit that. But yeah, I think it does just highlight, as I say, how far we still have to go. And I want to come to Carla on that. Something that you and I have spoken about, Carla, in terms of the role of the press, is the situation that a lot of LGBT plus people, as we say, particularly trans people, still have in public eye and in sport in particular. If you could speak a little bit about your reflections on that. I know that's something you're really interested in.
Sorry, did you say trans in sport?
Well, all LGBT plus,
LGBT.
but trans in particular have a much harder time than everyone else.
Yeah, okay, so this is in reference to that question and this question, which is, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And I think it's a lot harder to push away trans issues within Parliament if you have representation within Parliament as well. And I know that's easy to say, and Maureen was the same in the sense of what it was like to be an out lesbian at Parliament, and she didn't receive the support that she did from her colleagues. But I would hope that if we have a trans MP, that may be the case, that I really hope upon hope that they are supported within that and are given kind of the platform, and that might start to chip away kind of where we are now and the public perception. And again, within sport, if you can't see it, you can't be it. I mean, why do we have, especially I don't wish to generalize, but I'm going to, which is in heavily testosterone-led sports. I'm talking like the NFL, I'm talking Premier League, and basketball, etc. Why do we not see openly gay male players out? If you compare that to female professional sports, it's a much more inclusive environment, way more inclusive. And why does this, you know, this persist? It harkens back to what was it, not the Standard, the Spectator said, which is Maureen Colquhoun's entitled to a private life, except because she speaks about feminist issues, we kind of want to know if she's a lesbian or not, because that's going to change her views. Harks to, we want to know if you're gay in the locker room because, you know, willies. And it kind of feels like the same. It's like, well, if you've got an interest in that area, I don't know if I'm comfortable with you just being interested in that area because you want everybody that's involved in your sex to progress. And it seems like there's some parallels between that and male sport. It just seems really bizarre that we are in this situation where still male players are not out. They're not out, and maybe that's because they feel that they couldn't come out into a supportive environment. I don't know, but I certainly know that the way that they would be treated in the press, whenever somebody comes out when they've retired, it's still a massive news story. And imagine what that's like when you're a player, and let alone that, imagine what that's like when you've got hundreds of thousands of fans chanting at you. You know, God forbid that you be gay and be good for the opposition team. You know, what type of, not just online pressure, but the physical pressure of being in a stadium. And if you couldn't rely on the support of your colleagues, would you be brave enough to come out?
I know absolutely sort of all about football, but my fab co-chair, Johnny, was telling me the other day that I think the only currently playing gay man to come out in football was Justin Fashanu, a few decades ago, who then subsequently, I believe, took his own life. I could be wrong, he might not be the only one, but that's what Johnny said. Yeah, Carla, you look like you were going to say something there.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think his if it's the right guy, I think his brother tried to pay him not to come out.
Yeah,
because his brother felt so disgusted by it. That could be somebody else, but I think it might have been him. Yeah,
Johnny says that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, which is just horrendous. I mean, there's one thing is lack of support of your colleagues, another is your closest family members not being there for you and actively trying to pay you to deny who you were. Just yeah, that's the history that football has, I guess.
Yeah, and I think the message about support from your colleagues and for us, sorry, I know you all would have noticed that my dog has decided to join us. I assume that's fine. There's not much I can do about it if it's not fine. But I think that message of support from your colleagues has come through really, really strongly tonight. And I think coming back to Sammy, we spoke about at the beginning, Chris Smith came out, you know, nearly a decade later, was elected kind of 5 years later, and then Angela Eagle, who was only the second Labour MP, but came out, you know, almost 20 years after Maureen was outed. So it was really quite a long time before that representation happened again. How had, you know, Parliament, you know, and society progressed in that time? Was there a lot more support out there for them at that point? We had an event with Angela last week, and yes and no, I think, was her answer on that. But I'd be interested to hear your reflections.
Yeah, I think, you know, by the time Angela came out, Section 28, you know, was in force. Yeah. For a start, you know, which, as we know, created a whole host of problems in, you know, the real lives of people and the education of children, but also, I'm sure, in, you know, how therefore it was acceptable to be a queer person in the public eye. You know, if we're teaching our children that it's not acceptable to be gay or to choose that as a lifestyle, you know, how then does that translate to people like Angela, who is in the public eye and is expecting to advocate for, you know, the rights of her constituents, if her lifestyle is being deemed as unacceptable on a fundamental level? It's so, yeah, I think, you know, she can obviously, Angela can speak to that better than I can because she lived it, but from what I know from my research, you know, queer people in the late 80s and early 90s, you know, were really up against it because of, you know, Thatcherism. And particularly, you know, thinking about, I've done a lot of work with people that were probably the other end of the spectrum in terms of, you know, their privileges. You know, I interviewed people who were squatting in London in like the late 80s, and, you know, it became increasingly difficult as the 90s crept up to live in that way because of the imposition of Section 28 and all of the other policies that affected young, poor queer people who were like rejected from employment and their families, and so, you know, they fled to the big smoke to find community, and then couldn't afford to live and got sacked from their jobs. And, you know, it was a horrendous time. And so I don't doubt that in public life that support still wasn't there, even though it was becoming more acceptable that people like Chris and Angela were in positions of, you know, power, if we want to call it that. But really, there were still so many barriers for queer people on so many levels. So the very fact that, you know, Angela had the privilege and the advantages to get to where she was amazing, really, because the opportunities for young queer people at that time was still, you know, well, there just weren't as many opportunities for young queer people because it was held against them. You know, their lifestyles and their sexuality was held against them as something they were choosing to do, and was, you know, dirty and unclean. You know, particularly thinking about being in the middle of the AIDS epidemic in the sort of, you know, late 80s, early 90s. It really we like to think of history as like this linear progression towards, you know, freedom, but it really is so much more complicated than that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think what I was going to say in relation to Angela, you know, I think it's notable that she didn't come out publicly until she was already a cabinet minister, whereas Maureen obviously was outed while she was on the backbench. Chris did voluntarily come out, but he was also a backbencher. So there is kind of that element of the story as well, and you wonder, yeah, the relevance of that. I want to wrap up kind of around 8, maybe just after. And I think we've covered a nice range of topics, kind of historical, modern day, etc. But I do want to bring it back to Maureen, just, you know, to kind of bring it back to the focus and make sure that we are doing her story justice, and kind of give you both a chance to say anything that you haven't said already that you want to say about Maureen's life or her legacy and what she means to you. Yeah, so whoever wants to jump in first.
I think I can jump in and just say that if personally, if I can fight through as much as Maureen did and still have, you know, have the tenacity to fight and the courage, and do you know what, the endurance to put up with what she put up with, then I would consider myself exceptionally lucky. And that's what she means to me. She is a person that I can say and I can look to. Do you know what, when I'm having a tough time at work, or whether I'm finding something difficult, or nobody's getting back, or nobody's wanting to listen, to say, do you know what, I can Colquhoun this, I can get through it. I think that's what she can be, which is that light of, no, I'm going to push through, even facing her second deselection. She said, I will stand on my own and do this. You know, to have that resolve and that fight, I think is just an incredible gift. And if she can be an inspiration in that way, that's the way she's an inspiration for me.
Yeah, I think like she clearly found what she felt she was meant to do. You know, she felt that she was meant to speak out for people who couldn't speak out for themselves, even though that included herself. And I think that's what I take from sort of her example is, you know, we should find the things that we are aligned with and that we can contribute with integrity, and to maintain that integrity, you know, to the last, because you know, and then when you're tired, know when to say when and go to the Lake District, you know, because you can't sustain that. You can't sustain that. But I think yeah, and you know, I just feel that, yeah, she's a great sort of pioneer that we should, I hope that people after her death now will appreciate and you know, talk about more. And actually, just a small plug, I've just made a YouTube video about her for the History of Parliament's YouTube channel. So if you want to, like, you know, you've heard all there is to know about her from us, but you know, if you want to take a look and share it, or you know, whatever, please do, because I think, yeah, it's sad that it takes someone's death for them to be remembered, but I hope that in her, you know, in death, she will at least be remembered for, you know, the amazing person that she was.
I think that's a great message. We will 100% share that video. And I like that you said, you know, when you're tired, do what's best for you. You know, stand up for what you believe in, but you don't have to be a martyr to the cause. If you need to take your self-care and go to the Lake District or wherever is your happy place, then do that with my dog. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I just want to reiterate, we're going to sort of end there. Thank you so much, both of you. It's been a really interesting and an inspiring evening for me. We have recorded this, so we'll put it up on probably Facebook and things like that, so that other people can join, can have a look later. I'm going to plug a couple more Young Fabians LGBTQIA+ events. We mentioned LGBT education in this, and we're having an event on the 16th of March at 7:15, talking about LGBT education, and we've got West Streeting, who's the Shadow Minister for Schools, a representative from Just Like Us, which is a charity that sends LGBT young people into schools to help, you know, to speak to young people and show, you know, be a role model and things like that. And we're reaching out to a couple of others as well. We're hoping to get a representative from Anderton Park Primary, which is the school in Birmingham where it all kind of kicked off a couple of years ago. And then our trans officer Dylan is running an event on March the 31st, which is Trans Day of Visibility, about how everyone, all of us who are cis, can be the best trans ally possible. So bit of a plug for those, but thank you so much in the meantime for coming tonight. Really enjoyed it. And I think we had a really nice wide-ranging discussion with two really excellent speakers. So, and I also just want to say, actually, it popped into my head a moment ago, both of you kept saying throughout, oh, I'm not sure I can cover this, or oh, I think so and so would cover this better. Don't think a white cis straight man would say that, so just remember that you were both really good and definitely qualified enough to be on the panel. Don't sell yourself short, if that's a message that we can take from Maureen's life as well. So yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cheers. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.